Have you ever stood in front of the mirror, not to fix your hair or check your outfit, but to really look, not just at your face but into it? That faint line beneath your eye, the one that wasn't there last year. The way your skin doesn't bounce back quite like it used to. The strands of gray slowly multiplying in silence, no matter how often you try to deny them. And for a brief moment, just a flicker, you realize something you don't say out loud. This body is changing, not someday, not later, right now, every second. It's subtle, almost polite in how it creeps up. But the mirror doesn't lie. It quietly reminds us of a truth we spend our whole lives trying not to see. We cover it with makeup. We sculpt it at the gym. We inject, stretch, trim, and tint. But beneath it all, the same whisper echoes. This body is impermanent. This isn't poetry. This is the nature of existence. In Buddhist teachings, this isn't just a casual observation. It's one of the most fundamental insights into reality. Anicca, the Pali word for impermanence. Everything that arises will pass away. Everything. Your heartbeat, your breath, the thoughts racing through your mind. And yes, this body, this precious, beautiful, vulnerable body, follows the same law. But we don't like hearing that, do we? We live in a world obsessed with permanence. With youthful skin, sculpted muscles, and perfectly curated images that scream, "I'm still the same. I haven't changed." But inside, we know better. We feel time. We hear it in our joints when we bend. We taste it in the foods that no longer digest the way they used to. We feel it in the tiredness that lingers longer than it should. We carry this body every day, but rarely do we stop to truly see it for what it is. Not a prison, not a curse, but a mirror, a sacred messenger whispering the most honest truth we'll ever hear. You don't last forever, so live like it. The Buddha didn't ask us to hate the body. He didn't shame it or demand that we reject it. He simply asked us to see it clearly, without illusion, without attachment. To recognize that it's not really ours. It doesn't obey us. If it were truly ours, wouldn't we tell it, don't age, don't get sick, don't die? But we can't. Because it's not me. It's not mine. It's just a collection of elements, earth, water, fire, and air borrowed for a little while, held together by karma, dissolving the moment those causes unravel. Now you might wonder, if the body is so fragile, so fleeting, then why cherish it at all? Because its impermanence is not a flaw, it's a gift. It teaches us urgency without panic, presence without attachment, appreciation without clinging. It's the ticking clock that makes every moment precious, the dying flower that reminds us how beautiful blooming really is. When you stop seeing the body as something to control and start seeing it as something to understand, you move from fear to freedom, from chasing youth to embracing truth. In ancient times, monks and nuns would meditate in cemeteries, not out of morbid curiosity, but to see with their own eyes what we all try to hide, to sit with bones, to watch decay, to whisper to themselves, "This is the destiny of this very body." Not to scare themselves, but to wake up, because when you accept the impermanence of the body, you begin to let go not of life, but of illusion. And in that letting go, you become more alive than ever. So next time you look in the mirror, don't rush past the lines, the spots, the stories written on your skin. Pause, breathe, smile gently, and listen. The mirror isn't criticizing you. It's just telling the truth. And if you're ready to listen, the truth has so much more to say. If the body is always changing, always fading, always breaking down, then maybe it was never meant to last in the first place. Maybe it was never designed to. You see, in the teachings of the Buddha, the body is not a perfect sculpture. It's not a divine machine. It's not a temple to be worshipped or an identity to cling to. It is, at its core, a composite, a collection of fleeting parts dancing in delicate balance. Earth, water, fire, air, that's it, just those four. The bones and skin you call me are earth, the sweat, blood, and tears, water, your body, heat, fire, and the breath, that silent rhythm you barely notice, air. We forget this. We believe we own our bodies. We say my hand, my face, my heart. But stop and ask, who is this me who owns the body? And more importantly, where is that me hiding inside it? When pain arises in your back, can you stop it? When the stomach is hungry, can you choose to feel full? When sleep refuses to come, can you command it like a servant? No matter how much we wish we were in control, the body doesn't ask for our permission. It follows the laws of nature, not the whims of our ego. From the moment we're born, this body is breaking down. It's not a failure, it's a process. Cells regenerate and die. Organs wear out. Hair falls. Teeth loosen. Skin dries. Bones shrink. Every breath we take is a negotiation between life and death. And yet, we keep patching it up like an old house on a crumbling cliff. We don't want to admit it, but this body is a rented space, a temporary shelter built from borrowed bricks. And just like all things constructed, it will collapse, not out of cruelty, but because that's what all conditioned things do. The Buddha taught this with crystal clarity. He said, "This body is subject to aging, sickness, and death. It cannot escape these realities. Not because we are cursed, not because we did something wrong, but because we are made of impermanence. Trying to make the body last forever is like trying to hold onto smoke. It slips through the fingers, no matter how tightly we clutch. But here's where it becomes beautiful. When you stop trying to make the body more than it is, you begin to see it for what it truly is: a tool, a vehicle, a raft, as the Buddha said, to cross the river of suffering. You care for it, not because it defines you, but because it serves you on your path. When you see someone polish their shoes, you don't assume they are the shoes. They're simply preparing for the journey. In the same way, caring for your body is noble. As long as you remember that you're not polishing your identity, you're preparing the vessel. And when the vessel cracks, when sickness comes, when wrinkles deepen and the bones begin to ache, you can meet those moments with wisdom, not fear, because you were never promised permanence. You were only given a chance to wake up inside something that was always on its way out. So the next time you feel frustration with your body, when it doesn't look the way you want, or move the way it used to, or heal as quickly as you hoped, pause and remember, you are not broken. You were simply built to break, and in that breaking, if you're willing to see, something far more enduring begins to shine through. Because what lies beyond the crumbling shell isn't weakness, it's clarity. It's a deeper question rising beneath the skin. If I am not this body, then what am I? We don't suffer because the body ages. We suffer because we think it shouldn't. We don't suffer because the body gets sick. We suffer because we believe it's not supposed to. But where did that belief come from? Who told us that beauty should be permanent, that youth should last forever, that strength should never fade? We didn't invent these ideas. We absorbed them through screens, through mirrors, through whispers in the background of our culture. And now, like vines around the ribs, they squeeze us quietly with expectations we didn't even choose. It starts early. A child gets praised for being cute. A teenager learns to fear acne more than dishonesty. A woman is complimented more for her waistline than her wisdom. A man is told his value rises or falls with the shape of his muscles or the sharpness of his jawline. And so we begin the chase. We chase an image. We chase perfection. We chase some imagined version of ourselves that, deep down, we know is fading, but we can't seem to stop wanting. And it's that wanting, that tight, burning clinging, that brings the suffering. In Buddhism, it's called upadana, grasping, attachment. It's not the body that traps us. It's our idea of the body. It's the craving that says, stay young. The resistance that screams, don't decay. The fear that pleads, please not yet. And so we fight nature, not with violence but with subtle desperation, skin creams, diet plans, selfies filtered into unreality, not because we're vain, but because we're terrified. Terrified of being forgotten, terrified of being unwanted, terrified of what we'll see when all the layers are stripped away. But the truth is, no amount of grasping can stop the river from flowing. You can't cling to a sunset. You can't bottle a breeze. And you can't hold your body in place while time continues to move. Trying to do so only ensures pain, because every wrinkle will feel like a betrayal, every gray hair a punishment, every illness a sign that you're losing. But you're not losing, you're just living. The Buddha didn't teach this to make us feel hopeless. He taught it to free us. He saw the way people suffered, not because of what happened to them, but because of how hard they tried to fight what was natural. He saw kings and queens crumble in sorrow when their beauty faded. He saw ascetics starve themselves trying to outlast their mortality. And he saw ordinary people, just like us, trapped not by their bodies, but by their ideas about them. So what happens when we stop clinging? What happens when we stop seeing our body as a possession and start seeing it as a process? You begin to soften, the fear loosens, the pressure fades, and suddenly a wrinkle is just a wrinkle, not a crisis. A scar is just a memory, not a shame. A slower pace becomes a moment of mindfulness, not a flaw in the suffering, the deep, silent suffering that comes from resisting reality begins to dissolve. In the Dhammapada it is written, from craving arises sorrow, but he who is free from craving has no sorrow. Whither fear for him who sees the body as it truly is. What a question, what a path. You don't have to give up your body. You don't have to reject it, starve it, punish it. You simply have to let go of the illusion that it defines you, that it is you, because the body is not the problem, attachment to it is. And once you loosen that grip, even just a little, you'll find something else underneath the fear. A quiet kind of joy, a freedom that isn't loud but steady, a peace that isn't fragile because it doesn't depend on appearances. And as that freedom begins to take root, another question gently arises. If we stop clinging to how the body looks, can we begin to see what the body truly is? Close your eyes for a moment, feel your breath. In, out, now picture your body. Not the image you see in the mirror, not the version dressed up for the world, but the body as it really is. Strip away the skin. What do you see? Muscles, tendons, organs pulsing, working silently without your command. Rivers of blood flowing through veins. A cage of bones holding everything in place. There's no perfume here, no makeup, no lighting filters, just the truth. And it's not ugly. It's not beautiful, it simply is. The Buddha taught his disciples to contemplate the body in this very way, not to be morbid, not to discuss themselves, but to awaken from delusion, to see through the layers of fantasy and grasp the reality underneath. He said, in this very body, with its bones and flesh and blood, I declare there is the world, the origin of the world, the cessation of the world, and the path leading to the cessation of the world. The world is not out there, it's in here, right here under your skin, within your breath, inside the heat of your own bloodstream. Imagine you're in a forest and you come across a corpse left out by time. Its flesh is rotting. Its eyes have collapsed. The body is bloated, then dried, then turned to bone. This was an ancient meditation practice, the cemetery contemplations. Monks would visit these sites not out of morbid curiosity but to remember. This is the fate of my own body too. Not different, not special, just waiting. What happens when we look at ourselves like that? Not with fear, not with shame, but with honesty, Let's be honest. The body is a factory of constant decay and renewal. Every day, old cells die and new ones form. Your skin is flaking off. Your stomach is digesting. Your lungs are filtering air filled with dust and disease. And yet, this messy, miraculous thing lets you walk, laugh, cry, love, suffer, and awaken. That's not disgusting. That's divine in its impermanence, but only if you're willing to see it. Look again. Beneath the smooth surface is blood, thick and red, yet sacred in its flow. Beneath the breath is air, invisible, yet your most intimate companion. Beneath every heartbeat is a truth echoing softly. This will not last. And because it won't, you can finally begin to live. The body isn't pretending to be eternal. We're the ones pretending it is. It's been honest all along. It creaks when tired. It aches when ignored. It bleeds when wounded. It breaks when pushed too far. And still, we demand it to be perfect. Still, we cling to the illusion. But once you see clearly, once you drop the performance and simply observe, a shift begins to happen. You stop adoring the body blindly and start respecting it deeply. You stop fearing its changes and start learning from them. You stop chasing immortality and start meeting reality. And the more you see it, not through the eyes of vanity, but through the lens of wisdom, the more you realize, this body isn't me. It's not mine, it's just passing through. But don't misunderstand. Seeing the truth of the body doesn't mean rejecting it. It means freeing yourself from the prison of illusion. It means walking beside your own skin without pretending it's permanent. It means caring for your health but not building your identity on it. It means aging without shame. It means dying without fear. Because when you see the body as bones, blood, and breath, you begin to see beyond it. And what lies beyond isn't found in the mirror, it's found in silence, in stillness, in presence. And as you sit with that breath, that fleeting, precious breath, a quiet realization begins to take root. If this body is only a shell, then perhaps what matters most is how we move within it. There's something sacred about old hands, the way the skin folds gently. The veins rise like tiny rivers carrying decades of memory. The fingertips, softened by time, now tremble slightly, but still they reach. Still they hold. And yet, in today's world, those same hands are hidden, filtered, smoothed, edited away, as if wrinkles were shameful, as if aging were a mistake. But aging is not a flaw in the system, it is the system. The Buddha never promised eternal youth. He never praised smooth skin or sharp jawlines, he praised wisdom. And wisdom, like a tree, does not grow in a day. It grows through seasons, through storms, through letting go. He saw clearly. Everything that arises will age, decay, and pass away. And instead of grieving that truth, he used it as fuel. Of all the footprints, he said, that of the elephant is supreme. And of all contemplations, the contemplation of impermanence is supreme. But we live in a world that runs from impermanence. We glorify youth. We bury elders in silence. We sell miracle creams that promise to reverse time as if time were the enemy. But time is not cruel. It's honest. It gives us every second without debt. And it asks for nothing except that we don't waste it pretending we're immortal. Aging isn't what causes suffering. Clinging to youth is. You see, suffering arises when you mistake the temporary for the permanent. You wake up one day and realize your back hurts more than it used to. You forget a name mid-sentence. You look in the mirror and don't recognize the face looking back. And something inside panics. Wait, no, that's not me. That can't be me. But it is you. Just not the version you imagined you'd always stay. The body is changing exactly as it should. It's not falling apart. It's unfolding like autumn leaves, letting go without resistance. Buddhist wisdom doesn't tell you to deny aging. It invites you to meet it fully, to sit with it like an old friend, to listen to the stories in your joints, to smile at the laugh lines you earned, to respect the ache in your knees as reminders of all the places they've taken you. It's not about romanticizing aging. It's about releasing the fear around it, because fear makes us hide, but wisdom makes us shine. There are monks who have sat quietly under trees for decades. Their skin has thinned, their teeth have loosened, their steps have slowed. And yet when they smile, you feel a light that no wrinkle can dim. That's the radiance of non-attachment. That's what aging gracefully truly means, not resisting change, but moving with it, not fearing what fades, but trusting what stays. And what stays, not the hair, not the figure, not the strength. What stays is how you've lived, what you've let go of, what you've understood, how much you've loved without clinging, how deeply you've breathed without rushing. When you stop fighting time, you start hearing its deeper rhythm, the one that says, this moment, this exact breath, is all that's ever been real. So when you feel the years catching up, when you notice that you can't move like you used to, can't stay up as late, can't remember quite as quickly, don't grieve, bow to it, because life is teaching you what youth could never explain, that everything is precious because nothing lasts. Let's be honest, we've been told to worship this body, not in temples but in gym mirrors, in selfie filters, in diets, injections, surgeries. We're told to sculpt it, polish it, perfect it, as if the body were a temple, sacred, inviolable, eternal. But the Buddha never said the body is a temple. He said it's a raft, a vessel, a tool, a means to cross the flood. Think about it. Would you worship the hammer that built your house? Would you bow to the paintbrush instead of admiring the art? Would you build shrines for the boat while forgetting the shore you're trying to reach? The body is not meant to be glorified. It's meant to be used well, used to meditate, to serve, to walk the path of liberation. You don't need a flawless body to awaken. You need a mind that's willing to look inward, but the world doesn't see it that way. You're told, fix your body, then you'll be happy. Make it tighter, younger, sexier. As long as it looks perfect, you'll be enough. But that's a lie with glitter on it, because the body is built to decay. No matter how tight your abs, how glowing your skin, how symmetrical your face, time has its own plans. And its plans don't care about your beauty regimen. The Buddha taught us to look deeper. He didn't condemn the body, but he didn't cling to it either. He used it as it was, a tool for training the mind, a mirror to reflect impermanence, a field for planting seeds of discipline, compassion, awareness. He walked barefoot. He ate one meal a day. He sat under trees in scorching heat and monsoon rain, not to torture himself, but to remind himself, this body is not mine. It's not me. It's not who I am. It's just the vehicle I'm riding for now. You don't have to reject your body, but stop pretending it's your identity, because identity is too heavy. It chains you to vanity, fear, and endless comparison. You'll never be free if you worship what's falling apart, but you can be free if you use what's falling apart as fuel to awaken. In Buddhist monastic tradition, monks are taught to reflect on the body daily. They contemplate the hair, skin, blood, bones, bile. They meditate on decay, on rot, on death. Why? Not to be morbid, but to be honest. Because when you see the body clearly, you stop wasting time polishing the surface and start cleaning the mind beneath. The body can sit in stillness. It can chant, bow, breathe. It can carry you to the cushion, hold the hands of those in pain, kneel in forgiveness, stand up for justice, but only if you stop idolizing it. A tool doesn't need to be beautiful. It needs to be used wisely. That's what makes it sacred. There's a Zen saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The body doesn't become holy because you awaken. It becomes honest. No illusion, no shame, just simple function offered in full presence. That's real dignity. And here's the secret: when you stop worshiping the body, you actually care for it better. You feed it to nourish, not seduce. You move it to stay healthy, not impress. You rest it without guilt. You age with grace. You treat the body the way a monk treats his robe, not with obsession, but with mindful respect, because it's not yours, it's on loan, and one day it'll be returned. And when that day comes, when this tool breaks, as all tools do, you won't panic, because you never mistook it for yourself. You never clung to what was never meant to last. You never made a temple out of wood and water and wind. You used it well, kindly, with wisdom, and because of that, you are free. Everywhere you look, it's there. Billboards, commercials, movies, music, social feeds that scroll like endless prayers to the gods of beauty. But the gods we worship today don't ask for incense or offerings. They demand your self-worth. Click. Another influencer with impossibly flawless skin. Swipe. Another before and after showing a miracle body transformation. Like, comment, envy, repeat. The message is loud and it's relentless. You are what you look like. You are the body. And the body must be perfect. Not healthy, not functional, perfect. But here's the trick no one talks about: perfection is rented, and the price is your peace. What you see in the mirror is not stable, it's not fixed, it's not you. And yet modern society teaches us to obsess over every wrinkle, every sag, every gray hair like it's a personal failure. We don't age anymore, we expire. And so we spend, we inject, we filter, we pose, all to outrun time. As if Botox could stop impermanence. But the Buddha saw this game long before Instagram ever existed. He didn't need Photoshop to see the illusion. He taught, whatever is of the nature to arise, is of the nature to cease. That includes the six-pack abs, the glowing skin, the youthful glow that lighting tricks you into believing is permanent. In ancient times, monks would meditate in charnel grounds, graveyards. They would sit beside decomposing bodies. Why? To break the spell of illusion, to see the truth behind the surface. Today, our charnel grounds are Photoshop files. Our skeletons wear designer labels. Our corpses dance on TikTok with trending audio. But it's the same trick. Make death disappear. Make aging taboo. Make impermanence something to fear. Look around. How many products are sold on the promise that you can cheat time? Skin creams that reverse age, diets that renew youth, surgeries that restore you. But restore what? A version of yourself that never truly existed. We've forgotten how to see clearly. We look into mirrors, but we don't look into reality. We chase reflections, but forget their source. And every ad, every filter, every illusion pushes us further from the most liberating truth. This body is temporary, but you are not this body. In Buddhist teachings, clinging to the form rupa is the first fetter. And society, with all its polished magazines and curated selfies, feeds that fetter daily. It makes us terrified of natural things, aging, softness, sagging, slowing down. And instead, it glorifies the peak, that fleeting moment of youthful shine, as if that's the only moment you're allowed to feel worthy. But you were never meant to stay frozen in time. Even the Buddha aged. Even the enlightened grew old. And they wore their age like a robe. Simple, unadorned, and full of grace. We need a new kind of rebellion, a stillness in the storm. Not the rebellion of anger, but of seeing clearly. Looking into the mirror and saying, I am not this shape. I am not this trend. I am more than this temporary design. And in doing that, you reclaim your worth. Not from the mirror, not from the media, but from your own awakened awareness. When you stop believing the lie that the body must be perfect, you begin to treat it with true compassion. You feed it with care, not control. You move it with love, not punishment. You witness its changes with awe, not shame. Because now you see, society glorifies the temporary, but the wise see through it. And through that clarity, a quiet joy begins to rise, not from the smoothness of your skin, but from the stillness of your soul. The kind that creeps in when the noise fades, when the party's over, when the mirror no longer flatters, when someone we love is no longer here. It's the silence of endings, and at the heart of all fear, beneath the craving for youth, success, recognition, there it waits, the fear of death. Death, the ultimate taboo. In our culture, we rarely speak of it, and when we do, it's whispered behind closed doors. With nervous laughter or heavy denial, we sanitize it. We hide it in hospital rooms and coffins. We cover it in flowers and call it a celebration of life. But deep down, most people are terrified. Terrified because they've mistaken the body for the self. Terrified because they've clung too tightly to what must let go. But the Buddha looked death straight in the eye. He sat beneath the Bodhi tree not to escape death, but to understand it. And what did he see? All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. You see, impermanence isn't the problem. It's our resistance to it that causes pain. We mourn not only the loss of others, but the slow decay of our own form. We pretend we'll live forever, until suddenly we don't. But if we truly understood impermanence, if we lived with that reality daily, then death wouldn't catch us by surprise. It would be a natural exhale, not a tragedy. In Buddhist tradition, monks reflect daily. This body is of a nature to grow old. This body is of a nature to become ill. This body is of a nature to die. All that is mine, beloved and pleasing will become otherwise, will become separated from me. Is that morbid? Not at all. It's freedom, because what you accept you no longer fear. When you know the waves will rise and fall, you stop trying to freeze the ocean. You ride it, you respect it, and when the final wave comes, you bow, not with terror, but with understanding. There's a story in the Buddhist texts about a mother named Kisugatami. Her baby died suddenly. Grief-stricken, she wandered the village, begging for medicine to bring him back. The Buddha told her, "Bring me a mustard seed from a house that has never known death." She searched every home, and in every one someone had died. A child, a parent, a friend. She returned empty-handed but awakened. Death wasn't hers alone. It wasn't a curse. It was part of life itself. To truly live, we must stop denying death, because denial doesn't protect us. It only blinds us. But when we meet death with open eyes, it becomes our teacher. It strips away the trivial. It sharpens what matters. It humbles the ego, and it reveals a sacred truth. What dies is not you, only the form. Think of a candle. When the flame goes out, has the light vanished forever? Or has it simply returned to the vastness from which it came? Just like that flame, this body rises and falls, but awareness, pure, ungraspable, remains untouched. The Buddha didn't teach immortality. He taught liberation from the illusion of a fixed, separate self, so that when death comes, you're not holding on. You're letting go, not with panic, but with peace. Imagine dying not in fear, but in clarity, not as a collapse, but as a return. That's the gift of wisdom. And that's why understanding impermanence isn't just for monks or philosophers. It's for all of us, right now, while we breathe, while we walk, while we still have time. Because once we truly see death for what it is, we begin to live with a kind of fearlessness that no mirror, no media, no illusion can offer. And in that fearless space, a new relationship with the body arises. Not one of possession, but of partnership. Not one of control, but of compassion. And that shift leads us towards something even deeper, a way of being that doesn't fight impermanence, but dances with it. There's something quietly radical about simply being here, not in yesterday's regrets, not in tomorrow's promises, but right here in this breath. In this body. It sounds simple, almost too simple to matter. And yet this is where liberation begins. Our minds are addicted to the past and the future. We replay old wounds like broken records. We daydream about success, love, escape. We chase the next thing, the next thrill, the next distraction, the next version of ourselves. And through it all, the body waits, breathing, beating, dying, rebirthing. It doesn't speak in words, it speaks in pulses, tensions, aches, and stillness. And if we can learn to listen, truly listen, it becomes our gateway home. Mindfulness of the body isn't about glorifying it. It's not about controlling it, decorating it, or hating it. It's about dwelling within it with full awareness. Sitting with a backache, not resisting, not dramatizing, just feeling. Walking slowly, sensing each foot touch the earth. Noticing the rise and fall of your chest as you breathe. These seem like small acts, but they're acts of rebellion in a world that keeps pulling us away from now. The Buddha placed mindfulness of the body at the very foundation of his teachings, not just as a technique, but as a path to awakening. Why? Because the body is the most immediate thing we have. It's here, always here, anchoring us to the now whether we want it to or not. The mind can lie, it can fantasize, distort, distract, but the body tells the truth. And when we tune into that truth, without judgment, without story, something starts to shift. We begin to see that we are not our thoughts, not our habits, not our fears. We are the space in which these things arise and fade away. Just like sensations, just like emotions, just like clouds moving across an empty sky. That's why mindfulness of the body is not mere self-help. It's a radical dismantling of the ego. Because when you feel pain without attaching a story, when you feel joy without clinging to it, when you simply observe the body as it is, you begin to unravel the illusion of a solid, separate self. And in that unraveling, freedom is born. There's a reason so many Buddhist practitioners begin with the breath, because the breath is always now. You can't breathe in the past. You can't breathe in the future. You can only breathe here. And each breath, if met with awareness, becomes a portal, a doorway to presence, a return to simplicity, to silence, to truth. You might think, but what can mindfulness really solve? It solves everything that matters. It solves the tension that keeps you striving for what you already have. It solves the fear of death by revealing the miracle of being alive. It solves the ache of loneliness by bringing you back to the one companion that's never left, yourself. Voice slows, deepens. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need to go anywhere else. You just need to be here. Fully, when you eat, know that you're eating. When you're sad, know that sadness is present. When you breathe, feel the breath touch your ribs, your lungs, your throat. Because this is where awakening happens. Not in some distant realm, not after decades of chanting or austerity, but in the body, right now. A Zen master once said, "Enlightenment is intimacy with all things." And the first intimacy begins within your own skin. Can you feel this moment without judgment? Can you trust that even discomfort has something to teach you? Can you sit with what is, without needing it to be otherwise? Because when you can, you're no longer a prisoner of the mind. You're no longer chasing or resisting life. You're inhabiting it, moment by moment, breath by breath, truth by truth. And that is the beginning of the end of suffering. So here we are at the end, which in truth is another beginning. You've breathed with this body, felt its aches, seen it age, change, fall apart, and rise again. You've watched it mirror society's expectations and crumble under them. You've tasted the stillness that comes from simply being present within it. And now, it's time to let it go. Not abandon it, not despise it, but finally truly see through it. This body is not you. It is your companion, yes, your teacher. Your vehicle through this world of form. But it is not you. You existed before this body knew its own name, before it learned how to crawl or seduce or run away from pain. You will exist after it returns to dust. You are not the flesh, not the bone, not the image in the mirror. You are the awareness that watches the mirror. That's the great liberation the Buddha pointed to. Not in becoming something more, but in remembering what you've always been. Awareness. Not bound by skin, not measured by weight or beauty, not limited by age or ability, just pure knowing, still, silent, unshaken like the sky. While clouds pass through, all suffering begins the moment we mistake the cloud for the sky. When we cling to the body's youth, suffering. When we resist its pain, suffering. When we build an identity out of shape, size, gender, or strength, suffering. But when we see the body as just a temporary guest house, everything softens. Even fear, even death. You are not the one aging, the body is aging. You are not the one aching, the body is aching. You are not the one dying, the body is returning. You, awareness, remain, always. So how do you live with this knowing? You live lightly. You stop chasing what fades. You stop building castles out of sand. You stop waiting for the body to be perfect before you feel whole. And instead, you love it while it's here, care for it, respect it. Walk it mindfully through the seasons of this life, but never forget. You are not it, you are the one who sees it. This knowing doesn't make life dull, it makes it sacred. Because every touch, every breath, every sunrise is precious. Not because it lasts, but because it doesn't. The cherry blossom is beautiful, because it falls, and so are you. Let the world obsess over the body. Let it chase perfection like an illusion. You don't have to join, you are already free. Every time you breathe mindfully, you return to the truth. Every time you observe the body without clinging, you bow to impermanence. And every time you choose presence over performance, you honor the path of awakening. So what now? Now you live, not as a body trying to be eternal, but as awareness, eternally present. You live with compassion because you know all bodies fade. You live with peace because you no longer fear change. And you live with awe because even the ordinary, when seen clearly, glows. You are not this body. You are the witness of its rise and its fall, so walk gently, love deeply, let go freely, and remember, this body is impermanent, but the awareness that knows this is already free.